Ave Maria, everyone, and welcome back to the Life of Christ series. We're now on Luke chapter 1, verse 6, which says, "And they were both righteous before God, walking in all the commandments and ordinances of the Lord blamelessly." This, of course, is referring to Zechariah and Elizabeth, that they were righteous before God, walking in all the commandments and ordinances of the Lord blamelessly. First of all, they were righteous before God. St. Ambrose says that many appear righteous before men, but few before God, because men look upon the exterior, but God on the heart and consciences. St. Francis of Assisi says in truth, "Each man is what he is before God, and nothing more. For God's judgment is most true and most certain, while the judgment of men often errs and is deceived." Walking in all the commandments and ordinances of the Lord blamelessly. That is, observing all of God's commandments. That's what Zechariah and Elizabeth did. The moral precepts of the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, and ordinances, that is, the ceremonial precepts, such as sacrifices, washings, and other sacred rituals prescribed by the ceremonial law of God. Note well that God gave to the Hebrews, through Moses, precepts of three kinds. The first are the moral precepts, which are contained in the 2 tablets of the Decalogue, and which contain the laws of nature. We're talking about the natural law. What we must render to God and what things to our neighbors. So the first 3 commandments refer to God. The second 7 commandments refer to our neighbors. The second kind are judgments or court rulings, which relate to justice and human polity, and chiefly concern leaders and rulers that they might administer justice. In Christian society, civil laws have much the same function. The third kind are ceremonial statutes and decrees sanctioned by God, namely sacrifices and sacred rites for worshiping God suitably. These are called here and elsewhere ordinances. Now, why are they called ordinances? 3 reasons. The first, or rather 2 reasons. The first, because those who observe and fulfill them do what is most right and just. That is to say, they render to God the service and worship which is most rightfully his due. Thus, religion is a great virtue, transcending even justice. So the virtue of religion falls under the virtue of justice, which is to give another his due. And so with true religion and true worship, we render to God what is his due. Secondly, because by these statutes and by the observance of them, men formerly under the old law were justified legally. For those who fulfilled them were considered just persons by the synagogue, and that not only before man, but before God, if they perform those things from true piety and love for God. For the doers of the law are justified, says Romans chapter 2, verse 13. Finally, Zechariah and Elizabeth, they were without blame. They did all these things blamelessly. Note here that the faithful can, indeed ought to observe all the commandments of God. Wherefore it is possible to keep them and not impossible. So let's not say that God commands us something that is impossible, right, with the 10 commandments. In fact, St. Augustine here, he makes a distinction, and he says that without blame or blamelessly can also be interpreted as without mortal sin. For no just man in this life can avoid all venial sins, the Blessed Virgin Mary, of course, being the exception by special grace. So we do all have sufficient grace to avoid all mortal sins, but out of human weakness, we can't avoid all venial sins. So what is the lesson from Luke chapter 1, verse 6? Let us strive to imitate the righteousness of Saints Zechariah and Elizabeth by observing the 10 Commandments. etc. Let's not erroneously say that it is impossible to observe the Ten Commandments, but rather, with the help of God's grace obtained by prayer and the sacraments, we can do it. Saints Zechariah and Elizabeth, pray for us. Ave Maria.